This is the review for December 7th, 2020, and today I want to talk about Venezuela. Now, I specialize in what's going on in Eurasia. I'm based in Bangkok, Thailand, and so a lot of my analysis centers on Asia. But what's going on in Venezuela is easy enough to figure out because what the US is doing to Venezuela is exactly what the US is doing to Thailand right now. It's this soft power attack on the country, basically. It's everything just short for Venezuela. It's everything just short of war. But let's just take a look. This is what's going on in Venezuela. Recently, this month, Venezuela vote a fraud and sham. Maduro government illegitimate blasts Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State right now, as Trump continues to contest U.S. election. So they're kind of talking about the hypocrisy of how the U.S. is complaining about their own elections are out of order, and yet they're sitting there lecturing Venezuela about how they're holding their elections. But there's more to this story. Then it's the National Assembly that this guy, Juan Guaido, who the U.S. just unilaterally declared president of Venezuela, the National Assembly is going back under political parties loyal to Maduro. So this is good news for Venezuela, bad news for U.S. regime change. And I go to RT for news. I also go to Western sources. I want to see what the West is reporting. So Google News is a good way to see, an aggregate of all of this news. So Venezuela votes in an election the opposition calls a charade. Venezuela's Maduro tightens grip as opposition boycotts election. So you see that Venezuela is starting to get things back under control from this ineffective opposition led by Juan Guaido, who, despite all the U.S. support, has been unable to do anything. It's really a testament to America's fading power globally. But this one really caught my eye. Elliot Abrams, Iranian missiles in Venezuela will be dealt with. Business Insider. Let's go to this article. What this article is basically telling us is, again, like Iranian missiles in Venezuela, what does that mean? That they're not really, they're making it sound like a new Cuban Missile Crisis, basically, and that the U.S. will do anything necessary to stop this from happening, which is just, the soft power didn't work. The covert violence didn't work. The economic warfare isn't really working against Venezuela. So the U.S. is kind of opening the door here to military options, basically. They're creating a pretext. And this is one of those things where only the U.S. is going to have evidence of this happening, and they're going to have to move quickly to act before people are able to scrutinize the evidence or lack thereof. So this is the U.S. creating a pretext. And this Elliot Abrams, I thought this was interesting because this ties into what's happening here in Thailand. Because who is Elliot Abrams? Before he was appointed by the U.S. government to, basically help overthrow the governments of Venezuela and Iran, he was sitting on the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy. If we scroll down all the way to the bottom, there he is. He's on leave because he's busy off overthrowing Venezuela and Iran. And but that's what the NED does. That's what they exist to do. They're part of America's regime change apparatus. They fund opposition groups that are to be put in place once the government is overthrown. They also fund a lot of media, election monitors, every sort of thing that you need to overthrow a government. That's what the NED is funding. And now Elliot Abrams wanted to go pursue regime change more aggressively. The government assigned him to go do that more aggressively. So that's why he's on leave. And this is the same group that organizations here in Thailand backing the protesters, the anti-government protesters. This is who they're taking money from. People like this, people like Elliot Abrams. And the rest of these, none of these people are people you should be taking money from if you actually really care about your country, democracy, human rights, or anything. These are the last people you should be taking money from. Now, I want to point something else about. So that's what's happening in Venezuela right now. The National Assembly is going back under Maduro. The U.S. is trying to open the door for military intervention. I want to point out something else that always bothers me about the Western media's coverage of Venezuela. First, I want to point out what the U.S. is doing to Venezuela. We all know that they have sanctions on Venezuela. They announce it. They are constantly adding new sanctions to Venezuela and any country that attempts to do business with Venezuela. So look at this article from the New York Times. This is from August 2020. In diplomatic doubleheader, U.S. seizes Iranian fuel from ships headed to Venezuela. So America doesn't like Iran. America doesn't like Venezuela. They just seized an Iranian ship on its way to Venezuela. Doubleheader. That's what the New York Times says. This is essential fuel that Venezuela needs for society to function, for people to be able to live their lives, to go to work, to feed their families. And this is what the U.S. is doing, denying them that fuel. This is an article from Deutsche Welle. Let's see what the date is 2019. So this is from last year. The human cost of the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. And what it does is it just goes through all the hardship people in Venezuela face from the sanctions, the economic sanctions the U.S. placed on Venezuela. But then look at this, and this is what bothers me. Here's Venezuela, a country bled dry. Bled dry by who? You would think, obviously, the U.S. and their sanctions, their regime change agenda. But no. Here, let's read this. So this is a slideshow. This is the last slide from the beginning. Empty fridges, feeding the poor, hungry children, building with mud and wood. So everything, housing, healthcare, energy, everything, sanitation, everything is being impacted by the sanctions, as Deutsche Welle's said themselves in their own article. And let's see, when is this? Oh, so this is 2020. So in just a year, they've just look. Portraits of Hugo Chavez, Fidel Castro, Evo Morales, and all here they are. All of these people are South American, Caribbean. They're looking over an overflowing dumpster. Many here worship the socialist leaders of Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, and Ecuador like saints. But in Venezuela, the socialism of the 21st century has been unable to deliver on its promise of prosperity for all. Is that really socialism? Not delivering on its promise, or is this all of this and everything in this slideshow the direct result of this? The human cost of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. So even Deutsche Welle on their own website admit what the source of the problem is, but then somehow it's still Venezuela's fault, the government of Venezuela's fault. And this is how regime change works. They dig at a country semi-covertly, and then they blame the effects of what they're doing to undermine that country on the government they're trying to overthrow. So I just want to point that out for people. I'm sure people are aware of it, but it needs to be said more often. Now, I'm not like a socialist. I'm also not a capitalist. I have no political or economic ideology. I look at all of these things as tools to solve problems. And if you look around the world, you'll notice that every country uses a little bit of everything. Even China uses a little bit of everything to solve different kinds of problems. And socialism, when it's used properly, works. It works here in Thailand. We have universal healthcare. It works. It helps people. Everyone knows it's a good thing. The government knows it's a good thing. The people know it's a good thing. They know it's a right thing to do. And socialism is necessary when free markets are unable to deliver on something that society needs for people to have good lives, because people should be able to live good lives. So, Deutsche Welle is taking a dig at Venezuela's government and kind of smearing socialism for what? Because they already admitted why this is. We see the U.S. seizing fuel tankers to deny Venezuela the basic necessities for civilization to function, and we see them admit what the U.S. has done to Venezuela, and they still take a dig at the government and the form of economics that they're using. No matter what form of economics you're using, if some country seals you off from the rest of the world and is carrying out economic warfare and covert violence and political subversion, your country is going to fall apart. So, and the solution to that is not regime change, it's getting the US to stop, exposing the US and getting them out of Venezuela. So, anyway, that's it for today's review. For my patrons who make these possible, thank you very much. Please give me feedback on different topics you want me to cover, or maybe cover more, or cover a little less. And if you're watching this when I make it public, if you thought it was useful, please like and share the video. Look at the video description for all the references that for the websites that I've mentioned. And there's also information about supporting my work. So if you want to become a patron through my Patreon account, not only are you contributing monthly to my work, but you're also going to be able to give me feedback, and you're also going to get content and benefits in return. And as always, thank you very much for watching.